per questo evento che sarà in inglese oggi. It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce this fifth event in our program Urban Landscapes Indian Case Studies. And it's an even greater pleasure to welcome the diplomat and writer Antonio Armelini, who will provide an analysis of Indian society in the 21st century and refer to his recent book, If the Elephant Flies. Antonio Armelini was Italian ambassador to India and Nepal from 2004 to 2008. He was roving ambassador to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1990 to 1992, ambassador to Algeria in 1998 to 2000, ambassador at large for international anti-terrorism in 2001 to 2002, ambassador at large and special envoy to Iraq in 2003, and ambassador to the OECD in Paris in 2008 to 10. A specialist on international security and European integration, his interests include the geopolitics of the Asian region and multilateral economic cooperation, on which he has written and lectured extensively. Ambassador Armelini is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London and of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, and is currently a consultant to the City of Venice and to private companies and financial institutions on international affairs. I can't imagine a more interesting or appropriate speaker to have this evening, when we also welcome representatives of the British Academy in London, Britain's leading humanities and social sciences body, to speak with us at the British School at Rome about the work that we're doing, and it's marvellous to have the opportunity to bring these two events together. I would like to close by thanking the partners and supporters of this project, Architectural Association London, Domus, Maxi, and other supporters, and Marina Engel as ever for curating this programme. The challenges that Ambassador Armelini has faced in his own professional life, the countries that he's seen and the experiences that he's had, make him a remarkable speaker for us to have this evening. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us, and we look forward enormously to hearing what you have to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you for those very kind words. I hope you've not been too disappointed, just a little bit. So, a few words in Italian. I'll carry on in English after that, that's all right with you. Il tema di cui vorrei parlarvi questa sera è quello dell'India. Dell'India, delle città, di chi vi abita, di come sono costruite queste città, di come potranno diventare, di come città e campagna possano convivere insieme. L'India rappresenta cose diverse per persone diverse. Luogo di astrazione, di grande spiritualità, gigante economico che insidia l'Occidente con la sua crescita, potenza politica, sempre più anche potenza militare con mire di egemonia crescenti, coacervo multireligioso e multietnico, ad un tempo tollerante e violento, erede di una grande tradizione storico-filosofica, luogo di infinita miseria e di degrado, luogo al tempo stesso di straordinarie meraviglie, dalla magia del colore alla ricchezza di testimonianze architettoniche straordinarie, spesso realizzate mentre l'Europa viveva gli anni più bui del suo Medioevo. A me piace descrivere l'India come un carciofo, cioè ogni foglia che si toglie scopre una realtà diversa e questa foglia dopo foglia continua a essere sempre diversa, molte volte contraddittoria e spesso anche difficile per noi da comprendere. In tutto questo io credo che di tutte le realtà indiane la città è probabilmente il luogo dove più queste diverse manifestazioni si manifestano ed è possibile coglierle. The city then was a metaphor for contemporary India, an imperfect metaphor maybe, since seizing the richness of this country in its entirety is, in my view, more or less impossible. The first thing that strikes when looking at Indian cities is the massiveness of size coupled with an apparently unmanageable disorder. In the emerging economies, megacities are more or less the rule, and India is no exception to that. Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata all have a population ranging between 15 to 20 million plus, though no one knows exactly the size of the population of these cities because of the constant inflow of migrants, tens if not hundreds of thousands daily coming into these cities, of which it is impossible to keep track. All this, of course, while the overall population continues to grow, albeit at a much slower rate. The latest census interestingly showed that the fertility rate is coming down quite considerably in the main cities and urban centres, much less in the countryside. Three distinguished Italian intellectuals and writers, Alberto Moravia, Pierpaolo Pasolini and Elsa Morante, all travelled to India in 1963. The year which is of some interest to me because incidentally that was the first time actually I myself went to India as a student, coming back the other way around from California when I spent some time studying. Both Moravia and Pasolini wrote a book about their travels and their return. Elsa Morante was apparently too overwhelmed and could not write anything. The books are quite different. Pasolini's is a passionate declaration of love for the country and its people. He allows India to take him in its sway, and a torrent of sentiment often prevails on the ability to analyze and understand. Moravia, on the other hand, wrote a book which is a detached and very often to the point analysis of the country. Sentiment here gives way to rationality. At one point, Moravia bemoans the fact and says, how will it be possible to govern effectively a country of more than 400 million people? Well, India is now well over 1.2 billion. And Gurgaon, which is the upscale residential and business satellite city of New Delhi, has over 4 million, slightly, a little bit more than Rome. There are no proper roads, public transport or sanitation, however. And state-of-art high-rise glass and steel buildings, luxury gated communities and condominiums keep flourishing alongside the drearest of slums. The traditional structure of Indian cities is very similar to the traditional European one, built around a political, institutional and religious centre, with a mixture within its boundaries of social functions, economic activities, class and, to some extent, caste. I say caste to some extent because the role of caste is, in this context, sort of an inverse proportion to substantially wealth. Caste is a fundamental element in the poorer sections of the cities and of society. It becomes less relevant in terms of urban structure as the economic graph goes up. Caste remains a fundamental factor of Indian society, but that is from a different angle. So the model is what in Italian we would call a modello centripeta of these cities. Calcutta, for example, which was the first capital of Imperial India, was built along these lines and has retained them to this day to a far larger extent than the other cities. But what happened in the 19th century is that the centralization of imperial control during the Victorian era saw the introduction of a different and separate urban model. The uprising, or the First War of Independence, as it is now called in India, have caused everybody quite a scare. And so the administrators of empire moved into areas which were clearly separated from the rest, cantonments, civil lines, and so on. So the distinguishing trait of the first centuries of British presence in India, that of colonizers and colonized living alongside, very often in joint families, disappeared at that point, with this following the uprising and the creation of the empire as a unitary structure. But even cantonments and civil lines were built adjoining the old centres as parallel and not contrarian urban structures. This model was indeed so powerful that after the end of the Raj, the new Indian Babus moved into the same districts, replicating Maurya's habits and behaviour, and following the path even in the habitation of the previous occupants. These districts retained for long the same function, before being engulfed in the unruly sprawl of later years. I remember quite clearly that in the 60s you could distinguish quite clearly cantonments and civil lines and the rest of the city. They were parallel but separate. They're now indistinguishable. It's very difficult to find civil lines or cantonments as distinguishable urban street structures in any Indian city of today. New Delhi is perhaps the best representation of this parallel approach. It's, in this case, not just a district, but an entirely new city was built alongside of the remains of what had been a beautiful Mughal capital, and which had, after the uprising, changed very much in appearance and substance. The two cities, Delhi and New Delhi, adjoin each other and are not physically separated, just functionally separated. Lachand's New Delhi is once again a centripetal city, though perhaps it would be fairer to say that it was, because New Delhi is paradigmatic also in respect of more recent developments. The rapid expansion of the population, the growth of an aspiring middle class, all produced a fundamental shift in the structure of the larger cities. The possible exception is Mumbai, which is my favourite city because of the strictures imposed by its geographical location. And perhaps it is not by chance that probably the largest infrastructure project realized in contemporary India has been in Mumbai, the causeway which stretches along across the bay and eases traffic to some extent. Modern India felt the need to provide housing of a cosmopolitan standard, together with increased security, and the outlying villages were one by one turned into suburbs which bring very much to mind the structure of US suburbia. Low-rise family homes clustered around the main square with shops and services, few footpaths and many cars. Each is substantially independent and self-serving from the other and from the city centre. The subsequent phase then is that of the gated communities, which have sprung around the satellite cities of all the main megalopolises. Here, around-the-clock security, manicured lawns, superettes and gyms provide the illusion of living in a perfect world and the erased image of the traditional city with its contradictions, smell, confusion, but at the same time life, colour, and the sense of a multifaceted, culturally and ethnically diverse community. In cities like Mumbai, where such developments have been impeded by the lack of space, as I said, the answer has been more extreme. Entire new cities, reserved exclusively for the well-to-do, are coming up 60 and more miles from the old centre. High-rises are at the same time rapidly replacing the older, low-rise buildings. One can take a different view on these developments. Is it good or bad that modernity has come into the cities in this way? Aesthetic considerations would point into a negative direction. Others may mitigate this judgment. It's anyone's guess, really, and anyone's choice to say whether this was a good or a bad way to go about. Certainly, what has happened is that it has fundamentally changed the appearance of the cities and has, in many instances, brought about an accelerated degradation of their old historical centres without much resistance or outcry. The Indian middle classes now live in homogeneous urban surroundings in isolation from the rest of the population, but, of course, from the slums, which regularly spring around the new areas as unofficial but very necessary service providers of menial work, domestic staff, and the like. But it is for the roads and public spaces to bring everything back into perspective, bring it together, and provide a real sense of what urbanization means in India. Roads are not only a means of moving from one place to the other, often with great pain because of the traffic no one seems to be able to control effectively. They are also a place for all kinds of trade, flower sellers, hawkers of books and foodstuffs, and so on. They're also a residential site of sorts. The migrant labourers who come to the cities, mainly engaged in real estate and public works, bring with them their families and settle on the pavements adjoining their place of work. The road becomes a substitute for home, village, gathering place and food hall. These communities, in such a way, replicate the model of the village in the small space they occupy on the basis of a functional choice which ignores entirely the logic of urban space and which is accepted by the city dwellers as a normal fact of life. There are, of course, economic reasons for this. Developers would be loath to provide suitable accommodation and so on. But such an arrangement, I think, would be accepted with greater difficulty by those living and camping on the street, were it not for the fact that it allows them to retain, in a certain way, the communal approach of village life. Roads are also the space of the ragtag army of beggars that crowd every intersection, a combination of physical degradation and filth that at times defies imagination. Very often they're children. And to many a foreign visitor, the shock is such that they never entirely recover and come to accept them as an inescapable and socially accepted fact of life by all the parties concerned, including the beggars themselves. Actually, it is interesting for a foreign observer, particularly a Western observer, to look at the way in which begging is carried out on the street. Beggars are respectful in their begging, and drivers or passers-by are indifferent but not discourteous. It is the role in life of the beggar to beg. It is the role in life of the affluent not to respond. Each accepts its position and carries on without insult or injury, something which will be very difficult to imagine in individualistic Western societies, but is, I'll put to you, a small key to understanding why and how the whole place holds together, despite appearances which to us very often may appear incomprehensible. Slums are everywhere in the larger cities. Unlike what happens in other parts of the world, there is no physical separation between slums and residential or sanitized areas. Slums grow wherever I mentioned there's a need for low-cost, unskilled labor. To a Western eye, such coexistence would look like a sure recipe for violence, but in India this is not the case, apart from a few isolated exceptions. Slums are not all the same and come in different kinds. There are the shanty towns proper, which have been made in a way popular by films like Slumdog Millionaire, without any kind of facility other than illegal connections to the electricity grid, wherever that is possible. They are, of course, the lowest run, but don't forget that these shanties, shanties in communities of this kind, cities like Mumbai, trade at tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, you do buy and sell real estate property in these abysmally poor shanties for this kind of money because of the pressure of space, and also because they happen to be, as I mentioned, in the center of towns, and speculation is always behind the door waiting for the next opportunity to come about. One rung up, one finds the trawls. This is a name which is given to one-room lodgings built of brick and metal, and normally not more than 9 to 10 square meters in size, which operate as shops, factories and family homes all in one place. From these trawls, every morning, thousands of petty officers and shopkeepers leave for work in their immaculately starched white curtains, something which in itself is a miracle. Trawls have a minimum organization, some common spaces, communal latrines and so on. In one of them, actually, to my amazement, I saw in Mumbai, this was, in the midst of an open-air sewer, a modern coin-operated laundrette, which is the last thing you would expect to see in a place where there's a special caste which deals with laundry and is actually very active. There's another separate caste which deals with ironing, and that is one of the reasons why you get these splendidly ironed and clean curtains every morning. All slums are organized along lines, fairly rigid lines of social division and caste solidarity. The immigrant that comes into a large megacity is drawn to the areas where he will find his caste peers, because that is where he will replicate the model he has abandoned, where he will find immediate solidarity. So in fact, the slums operate as an element which reinforces the caste dimension of social organization in India rather than the other way around, not in terms of discrimination, which is a voluntary situation, but in terms of allowing people who have no reference of any kind, no protection of any kind, to find a place in the city where they can be together with others who will have their same social condition and not will suffer or be privileged according to everybody else, and find ways in which to start making a headway in what is, in every other respect, a very different and hostile environment. Naipaul, in his book India, A Million Mutinies Now, recalls the desperation of families forced to give up their chores where everyone knew everyone else and was ready to give a hand if needed, putting aside eternal fights for space or this or other cause of discontent, in order to force them to move into modern flats, where they were going to be introduced to what many of us would welcome as privacy, but which to them seemed like intolerable isolation and discrimination. Then, of course, apart from the cities, there are the villages. The villages belong to an entirely different species. It is here, we should not forget, that lives the vast majority of the population. Over 60% of the population is in villages, mainly occupied in subsistence agriculture and related activities. It is a completely different world. Services, roads, infrastructure are at a minimum, and where they exist, they are of an extremely rudimentary standard. The distance from the aspiring urban India could not be greater. And yet, the physical separation of some years ago has been gradually eroded by creeping modernity. The staid and old state-owned Doordarshan TV channel which, in comparison to which the Rai and BBC of the 60s would look like icons of revolutionary change, is feeling the heat of the ever-increasing private satellite broadcasters, which offer the usual US-inspired consumer fare we have been accustomed to everywhere in the world. A landline telephone connection was considered a great privilege in India up to a couple of decades ago, and an impossible dream anywhere else in the country. The incredible growth of mobile connections has put paid to this, and now very few are the villages which are not connected to one or other of the private services. There's an interesting tidbit of Indo-Italian history here. One of the private service providers in the late 90s was an Italian firm. Those of you who are in Italy are certainly aware, and perhaps not particularly appreciative, of Telecom. And Telecom, or TIM, owned one of the mobile phone operators in it, which it proceeded to sell to an Indian company at a very good profit in the late 90s. At that time, this provider had 400,000 connections. Mr. Bharti, who owns this, now proudly declared a few months ago that they topped 100 million. This took place in 15 years and has made Bharti a great admirer and great lover of Italy for obvious reasons related to his increased prosperity. All this, however, has not changed the social structure and living habits. Caste dominates the organization of villages far more than anywhere else. Yes, I spent some time trying to understand how caste operates, how it works, and I came to the conclusion, which is shared by someone who knows far more than me. So some people claim to understand, others share the view that it is actually possible for a non-Indian to come to grips with the concept in its entirety. But I think one can safely say that, as I mentioned earlier on, the importance of caste grows as you move away from large urban centres. In a village, by and large, caste is still the fundamental element of social organisation of all kinds. You do not marry out of your own caste. If you do, you are expelled from the village. Every now and then you might also be killed. It depends on the village and depends on what the difference between the caste is. I have seen, it is residual, but I have seen it. A situation whereby so-called untouchable begs for food in the evening, and the way this is done is that the person will walk slowly down the centre of the centre is very important, because shadow defiles, and so you cannot project your shadow on. and then food is put out of door. Now, this seems absolutely intolerable to us, but it is part of a structure which is accepted. I think when one looks at India, one can certainly take into account that this is a fundamental factor of difference between us and the way in which we organize our society and others do. But it is a system which will have to be managed, geared, and changed within the confines of a different society. Society which has its own fundamental values, which are as good as those of anybody else and as good as ours, and which caste will retain for a long time, I think, an important function, negative in some ways, interesting, evolving in others. I will not spend too much time on this, but just to give another couple of thoughts. Caste, by the way, through the British audience, this might be particularly interesting. Caste is now rigid and hereditary. You're born into a caste, you don't get into a caste. It was not so up until the 17th, 18th century. The great classifiers and those who coded the caste system are British colonizers. There are now 4,000 plus castes which have been analysed, described. I forget the name of the author, it's a huge 9-10 volume work, which is the foundation of contemporary caste system. Some people say that no one better than the Brits could understand the functioning and meaning of a system such as caste. But I will leave that consideration to you. But caste has now become, it is no longer an element of professionalism. Before you belong to a caste according to your trade or profession. This is long since gone. Caste is not an element of class. There are low caste billionaires, and there are more and more impoverished Brahmins. So caste and class, that is one of the things which is probably more difficult to understand from ourselves, the correlation between caste and class, which follows a completely different parameters to the one we are accustomed to. And caste is becoming more and more an important element in forging political consensus in the country. You tend to vote by caste in a number of areas, a number of regions, irrespective of what your class or economic direct interests could be. This again is changing slowly, but I think it is an important element to bear in mind when looking at caste before bemoaning it. One has to bear in mind it should be put in context. India has no social security system, but this is perhaps less of a problem in the village than in the cities, where demands for proper health are more acute. It does, on the other hand, India have a universal education system, and even the remotest village has a school that provides pupils with a uniform and a meal, but not much else. Teachers are frustrated and underpaid and very often don't turn up at all. Of all the misfortunes of rural India, this is perhaps the one that impinges negatively most on its future. The power of the state is, as a rule, remote and ferocious. So rural India will change for sure, but at a much slower pace than the one could imagine. It could be argued that a faster pace of change would be unsustainable for the overall equilibrium of the country. The Hindu ethic, which presides over the coexistence of a very diverse population, would be put in serious jeopardy by too rapid a move. The migrants who leave in search of a better future in the megacities cut all their links with their ancestral villages, as they're called in India, and enter into an entirely new world, completely removed from the one they abandoned. Memories fade rapidly, and those left behind don't feel envy, left behind the villages, don't feel envy, and are seldom tempted to follow suit, because they feel that in doing so they would be doing more than just moving their bodies and few possessions. They would be, in fact, exchanging their souls, and in many cases are not prepared to do so. All this will change, for sure, but one of India's fortunes is precisely that it has inbuilt dampeners to make that change acceptable to the overall slowly moving equilibrium of the society. In this very much helped by the fact that India is a democracy, and therefore collective will is expressed freely at regular intervals, but nevertheless it is a function which is extremely important with looking at the ways and wherefore of social and political development in this country. I've used the metaphor of the city to talk a little bit about the present. I think it can be applied also to the future. The megacities will continue to expand and attract new waves of immigrants from the impoverished rural countryside. modernity and misery, will continue to exist in an uncanny equilibrium managed by Hindu ethics, but also by an imperfect but very real workings of democracies. Cities will not become much better, but neither will they deteriorate beyond repair. Hope and the determination to carry on and make good will continue to be the essential engines of tolerance in what is essentially an unequal society. From time to time, the new suburbanites and the slum dwellers will coincide, but never in a systemic way. Violence in India is often ferocious as it is sudden, but it is not revolutionary. The ideas of People's Revolution and the spirit of '68 do not belong to this world. The megacity model will continue to replicate itself in the so-called medium-sized cities, medium-sized in Indian terms, anything up to 5-6 million, which are already establishing themselves as the new centres of economic and political power of the country. Ahmedabad, Kanpur, Cochin will follow the path laid out by Delhi and become more decentralized and quote-unquote American. The village at the same time will continue to subsist in a parallel world. The government's effort to improve the lot of farmers will be very slow in producing results, but change will come about in many ways. The rural population will have to come down drastically from its present levels, and new opportunities will have to be created in the till now dramatically underpowered manufacturing sector. Just think that the more or less 10 million employed in the service and IT sector are responsible for about 40% of India's GDP. The 600 involved in countryside are between 20 and 25%. There has to be a change in this. And manufacturing between accounts for about 15. And that is where the change will have to take place. Education, infrastructure, industrialization can all be accelerators of this change. They are sorely needed, but at present are seriously lacking. The road metaphor applies yet again. India has a serious problem of inadequate physical infrastructure. Transport networks and power grids are dramatically below standard and effectively hamper development. But where the bottlenecks are more evident is in road infrastructure. For years now, the government has boasted over 6,000 to 8,000 miles golden quadrilateral quadrangle, or 4 to 8 lanes superhighways connecting the main cities. Only bits have been completed here. I used to, normally, when I was talking to my Indian interlocutors and they were always talking about this, I say, I have, in my time in India, been singularly unfortunate. Because I was told, the government regularly informs that 60, 70, 80% of the quadrangle is now completed. And I said, my misfortune is I've always travelled in the remaining 20% and never been able to get hold of the rest, which is, I think, still very much the situation, in the situation in that country. Moving goods from Delhi to Mumbai today requires quite a few days of the crossing of more than 10 interstate borders with the associated queues and obvious backhanders. Air transport is efficient on the other hand, but it concerns essentially the aspiring middle classes. Rural India will have to continue relying on old-fashioned trains and most of all on their feet, so that only the bravest will dare to move very far. Does all this mean that India is a doomed country? Is it a society condemned to indefinite stagnation? I believe the contrary to be true. The shortcomings I have tried to underline would be unsustainable in our societies, but are manageable, as I said, in societies such as India's that can effect change at a pace that will not put into question its fundamental tenets. Democracy is for real in this country. It allows the venting of protest and frustration, and provides for effective alternation in power. Not enough to eradicate corruption, maybe, but sufficient to make the pulse of the nation visible. Contradictions exist everywhere, and here they are accepted better than in other individualistic societies as in the West. The acceptance of one's condition, deeply ingrained in the Hindu ethic, and the strong feeling of commonality among different groups are very important stabilizing factors. Ma il fattore che forse più di tutti fa pensare all'India in una chiave positiva è questa can-do mentality che ricorda molto a me, forse a quelli della mia generazione, quella mentalità che esisteva in questo paese, in Italia, negli anni 50-60, quando la ricostruzione avveniva e qualsiasi traguardo sembrava possibile. Anche allora le contraddizioni erano numerose e molti pensavano che questo miracolo fosse impossibile, invece c'è stato. E questa cambio mentale è forse l'arma segreta che potrebbe determinare un futuro dell'India migliore.